We're glad you joined us today when we'll have a conversation about the changing roles of women in families as we're in this season of so many family-related transitions. Stay with us for today's Austin Faith Dialogue.
This is Austin Faith Dialogue, a public affairs program discussing the important crossroad of religion in life, produced by Austin Metropolitan Ministries in cooperation with KTBC TV. Austin Faith Dialogue highlights the interaction of the religious community with the social and cultural issues throughout our area. Now, today's edition of Austin Faith Dialogue.
I'm Sandy Wilder, your host today for Austin Faith Dialogue. Thank you for joining us. This is the season of a lot of family-related events. There's Mother's Day, Father's Day, graduations, all kinds of transitions. And some of the transitions have to do with the way women's roles are lived out differently in families these days. My guest today is Reverend Sarah Bentley, who's Associate Director for Counseling at New Life Institute here in Austin. Glad to have you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Tell us a little bit, to set the stage first, what New Life Institute is, and then we'll get to talking about some of the work that you're doing.
New Life Institute is a center for counseling, education, and spiritual growth that was started just about 10 years ago, 1986, and begun in relation to the Austin district of the United Methodist Churches, but people from all walks of life and all faiths regularly use our services.
Okay, and we're about at the season now of Mother's Day, which is sometimes known in some denominations as the Festival of the Christian Home. And my guess is that sometimes for women this can be a difficult time, perhaps in the same ways that Christmas and Thanksgiving are difficult, but perhaps in other ways. Can you talk a little bit about how women approach this day in their honor?
Well, we might just say briefly, both those holidays that relate to parents, Mother's Day and Father's Day, are occasions when people might begin to experience or think about the fact that they don't have a perfect relation to their parent, or they don't have a perfect family, because no one has a perfect family. And so if those holidays tend to make people think about idealized views of things, that's difficult. So whether you're a mother or the daughter of a mother, which all women are, then you might find yourself sort of stirring around inside about, how do I feel about how I'm carrying out the role? How do I feel, you know, about my mother? And the view that she presented to me of being female and being a woman in today's world. And of course, most women are really today almost a different generation than their mothers were. And so the issues are presented to us in very different ways.
As the roles of women in the family are changing, what do you find in your practice that women are experiencing if they run into, say, difficulties?
Well, we began approaching families, I think, in a unique way, at least in terms of Austin and the religious community, and that was to think about the family as a system of connections, what we might call an emotional system. So we do educational programs too. We don't only do therapy or counseling. And what we began to find was that both women and men were doing a lot of thinking about how to do family life differently. And again, our parents are such important role models that, for instance, if you've lost a parent, especially in early childhood, that can really form and inform the ways that you go about trying to grow up, trying to do your role. I think we were speaking earlier that a book came on the bestseller list of the New York Times. I have a copy of it here. It's called Motherless Daughters, and in truth, it's about people whose mothers died when they were children, but it has sparked enormous dialogue and interest among all sorts of women about what they received in terms of mothering and how they feel about, well, taking care of yourself sounds sort of self-centered, but, you know, in order to have a full life and be a good parent and a good partner, you also have to be able to look at self-care. So we've found issues around loss and stress, and also abuse, whether women were abused growing up, just as men can be, or whether they were in abusive relationships. And that's where I, of course, started my work.
I remember when I was younger that my impression of what was just called Mother's Day then was it was a sort of a rosy time to honor this feminine ideal of a mother, perhaps a paragon of virtue, someone that you put up on a pedestal, all those sorts of cliches. It sounds as if women approach mothering and running a family in really different ways these days.
Well, you know, I kind of think, Sandy, that people are changing in general in their willingness to not so much, you know, get on a TV talk show and tell all your secrets, but to acknowledge that some of their experiences in families have been difficult. And so, of course, women's experience as mothers, again, or daughters or siblings is part of that. And no, we really do try to be more realistic. For instance, in preaching, as a pastor, I may talk about biblical stories that show that people are human and families are human. There isn't a perfect parent. I mean, we honor our father and mother because they gave life to us and because they stand in the generation ahead of us. That doesn't mean we unequivocally agree with everything or respect them for everything they've ever done, or, you know, obey them in sort of a traditional, more authoritarian way. And especially, yes, with mothers, we found that people felt guilty if they acknowledged, you know, I didn't have such a close relationship to my mother. What if my mother was sad or ill, literally physically ill? What if she was abusive? You know, how can I idealize that? I mean, and then the struggle as an adult just to know that it's all right to have different feelings about a parent, maybe especially a mother, but people seem to have very deep feelings about all their family connections.
So that it's okay today to go back and explore what might have been a painful childhood or some wounds from one's growing up.
Well, the way we are approaching things has even changed over the years, particularly as we continue to work with families as a whole. What we're looking for is the strength and the resiliency in a family. You know, tell me about the gifts of your family life. Wow, how did you all get through that experience? How did you handle that crisis? And when you look back at the generations in your family, we'll typically talk about 3 generations, are there patterns that were helpful to growing and changing and becoming a kind of resilient, you know, stress-resistant person? Or are there patterns that weren't so useful? What were they? How can you avoid them? And not what we might call pathologizing or making a family bad or wrong, but just saying that's an experience you certainly don't want to carry forward as a parent or even as a partner. Or as a person on your own, you don't not want to have a legacy that says, you know, there's something wrong with me and my family. That's just not a very empowering or freeing feeling to have. It's discouraging.
Now, you've talked about educational work. I assume some of that is not just with individuals or couples or small groups, but in congregational settings. So if you were working with a congregation of any denominational background, how might you encourage that congregation then to respond better to families' needs?
Well, we have several really unique programs. One program invites a marvelous rabbi, Edwin Friedman, who's a teacher and a pioneer in this field, to come and work with clergy and other religious leaders, and to look at family systems in the congregation, because a congregation is often very much like a big family, to help the clergy or the religious professional or even public officials, other leaders, business leaders, look at their own family and how it intersects with their life as a leader. And I do a lot of work with Christian educators. We work with all kinds of professionals in the religious community to look at their programs. What are they saying about family? What are they teaching? And then, of course, classes, retreats. We have a number of different people working at this center that do retreat work. And then we have a spiritual director who does retreats, and she and I are working on the whole idea of spirituality and family life and everyday life. Family rituals, what else goes on besides Mother's Day and Father's Day and Children's Day. All families have rituals that do or do not contribute to the richness of their life. And we can actually learn those things if we don't have them. That's my kind of repeated refrain as an educator. You can learn this. This is not a mystery, you know.
If you were going to design, say, an ideal large family system, say in a congregation as a whole, what might some of the characteristics of it be? What might it look like?
Well, the two things that we really look for in family are individuality or separateness, which does not mean cut-offness. It means my ability to have my own life, have some boundaries, know how to say yes and no when I need to, and each person having that really God-given gift of their own life while in connection. So for instance, with leaders, you're asking people to lead with vision and to foster connection even as they foster people's, say, individual vocation or their individual way of being themselves in the world, their individual gifts. So there's this wonderful rhythm, or I guess balance, if you will, between being a person who has rights and responsibilities and freedoms and gifts, and being a person who is connected to others. So we try really to work against the old juxtaposition that, especially for women, I should be living for others and not for myself, like it's selfish. And that's just kind of an outmoded, I guess we might say, version of self in connection. It's not selfish. You have to take care of yourself, particularly as a mother and a wife, because then you're not able to be there for other people or to do your work. You know, huge percentages of women work outside the home now at some time in their life.
I'm wondering how that might translate into congregational terms. I suppose there are congregations or religious groups that also live for others and don't take care of themselves?
Well, that's a good question, Sandy. I don't know if I've thought about it that way. In most religious groups, there is an emphasis on mission, but there's also now an emphasis on spiritual growth and healing. And hopefully part of the dialogue, yes, is to be truthful. What kind of issues do we have as a congregation? Bob Bryan, who's the director of New Life Institute and is my husband, for instance, has trained in working with congregations that have experienced conflict. People come to a congregation and they think, now I'll be safe. Oh, good, I'll have a good home. And the next thing they know, they're having the same kind of problems. Well, this isn't surprising because it's a human institution. So working with people about how to resolve conflicts is a form of self-care in a congregation, and helping people understand inner growth as the actual balance to outward activity. They just totally go together. I can't have a good, dedicated life if I'm not supported internally by my spiritual life.
Right.
Does that make sense, the way I'm saying it?
It does, and it brings up some new thoughts, I think, for all of us. We'll come back with some more questions here in a minute. Now we'll take a break to talk a little bit about Austin Metropolitan Ministries. Stay with us for the next half of Austin Faith Dialogue.
Serving Austin means serving you. That has always been the primary goal of Austin Metropolitan Ministries. We are religion in action through the work of these organizations. Each plays a key role in making the capital city a better place to live, but we can't do it alone. Do you have some spare time, talents, or any resources that you can share? If you do, please call AMM at 472-7627, because serving Austin means serving you.
We're glad you've stayed with us for Austin Faith Dialogue. I'm Sandy Wilder, your host today, and my guest is Reverend Sarah Bentley on the staff of New Life Institute here in town. We've talked a little bit about family systems in general. I wonder if we might talk now some about the Institute in particular, the place where you work and the particular work that it tries to do. You've said now that there are several people on staff. What kinds of skills do they have?
Well, we've tried to bring together a group of people who can do actually quite diverse things, not just one-to-one counseling, because a lot of growth and change really takes place in other settings. So, for instance, we have a person on staff who's a social worker, and she's worked a lot in hospitals and other settings. Several of us also work in other settings while we work there. And so that gives us a lot of insight. I serve parishes from time to time. Several of us work with corporations or office settings, let's say a law practice or a government agency that is working to develop a new way of working. We have a program 3 times a year called Career Life Workshops, in which a weekend program is available to folks who are considering changes in their work life or retirement, some kind of a transition which they're planning or which came upon them because they're unemployed. We can work with whole families, with parents and teens. One of our staff people, together with Bob Bryan, is a parish educator. They're developing a program that prepares couples for marriage or deals with strengthening the relationship you're in, marriage or otherwise. Naturally, we do retreats around marriage. We have, I think, one of the oldest church-related or religious community-related divorce recovery programs in Austin. Started that actually before the Institute in 1983, or 4, I think, and we do various workshops on that several times a year and a weekly support group. And then we have retreats. A spiritual director, Reverend Mimi Raper, gives retreats. We do retreats on forgiveness and, again, emotional healing for families, and have helped with healing services in local churches, although that's kind of more, that's become more common. The area that I'm most excited about is our developing connection with people's issues and stresses and problems that they face in the workplace. We've been called at certain occasions to workplaces where there's been a sudden death, like an accident on the workplace, or a tragedy like a killing, a murder. We have been invited in to do stress work. One of our board members is wanting to develop he's been a businessman and he's also a counselor, and he wants to develop a program that really helps business leaders see ahead of time where the problems are going to be with their employees. Again, offering leadership development coaching, if you will, for business leaders, help with especially small business people. It's very stressful to run a small business, particularly a family-related business. There you take the dynamics of family and you put it together with work, and you've really got, you know, the makings of either something wonderful or something pretty difficult. And I think that transitions are so common in people's lives that understanding those and being just supported in kind of, I call it riding alongside somebody as they go through a transition.
I think we've got someplace a little slide that has the logo of the Institute and the telephone number. With any luck, we'll get that there up on the screen for folks to call you all. And I'm intrigued with the name. It sounds then as if the name New Life refers not just to spiritual life within a congregation then, but new life in all the arenas in which someone might find themselves.
Well, when we were really creating the Institute, the images that came to mind were biblical, and actually they're primarily Old Testament images from the prophets and from the Psalms. And our 3 key words were restoring, renewing, and reconciling. And this is a part of human life, and I think our own conviction was that if the religious community doesn't lead in these areas, who does? I mean, in a fast-growing town like Austin, where it's difficult to reconcile conflicts, it's difficult to understand the changes that are taking place so fast, and the loss of jobs or the changing in the workplace, that touches people at every level. Whether we think of it physically, my own interest is very much in kind of mind-body connection, and stress reduction and resiliency. Emotionally, which includes relationships, but also people's struggles with depression and anxiety. We have a very fast-paced culture. That tends to make people anxious without even realizing it, as well as spiritual and mental. We have an exciting new focus, which a lot of people in town use, on the cognitive or the mind element of life, which is, how do I think about life? You know, as a person thinks, so they will become. That's an old sort of biblical idea. And we can actually learn to think differently, not just like shape up, get over it, you should think positively. But we can study the patterns of our thinking and change them and feel differently and even lose some pain, literally physically. Some emotional energy comes back. And it's just really exciting to work with those kind of changes wherever someone feels their need, if that makes sense.
Right. Oh, fascinating work. Tell us a little bit about you as a person. What brought you to this kind of ministry, and where your growing edge is these days?
Well, I like to say to people who come and say, oh, I'd love to do what you do, I'd like to say, oh, really? How much would you like to go through to get there? I kind of backed into this work. I was a teacher in seminary, and I still do that sometimes, and I was a retreat and workshop leader. And when I moved to Austin and Bob and I got married, interestingly, I went through a lot of the stresses and transitions that women do when they lose virtually all their individual identity in moving to a new town. And I was married to somebody who actually is quite well known in Austin. And I didn't have a job, and I was finishing school. And I really, frankly, suffered a lot of the stress and the depression that comes with those kind of changes. I discovered some unmourned losses in my own life. And I started to grow, as I like to say, sort of backwards, you know. And then, of course, I was working with this grant that I had to work with women who were abused, and was working in the family violence movement. And I just gained so much experience. And my original perspective has always been that the gospel, or the biblical traditions, the traditions of book, but also all faith traditions, have some really very, very important things to offer people. And why weren't those traditions speaking to people's pain, as well as to their need for hope? And so really through my own journey, I think my growing edge now has to do with going back to the things I love, which include movement and body-related things, and I like to say play because my work is so enjoyable, but helping people lighten up through letting go of the burdens of their life. I like to work with preachers about how they can preach differently. People often say, why you preach such a hopeful message? And I say, well, I have the advantage of having felt hopeless. And you don't want to hear a very discouraging message, but you want to hear something authentic when you sit in the pew.
Yes.
And so I really alternate. I'm not always in the pulpit. I sit in the pew and listen and try to think, how does this make me feel, what I hear? Or how does it make me feel when I read the newspaper about what the religious community is doing?
It is marvelous when that diversity of experiences, pain and joy, can be brought together to do something really creative. Well, our topic today has been sort of around ministry with women. And where do you see the growing edge, for want of any other term, in terms of ministry with today's women, or at least Austin's women?
Well, let's just say, for the sake of argument, that Austin's women aren't different than other women, though I think Texas women have a certain pluckiness that's just wonderful. And Austin has such diversity. There's all sorts of ways to grow and change. I think that what we're moving toward, and we are in the process of developing a set of workshops and groups for women that focus, for instance, on issues of mother-daughter connection, self-care and healing for women, persistence, and I like to say persistence and resilience in the workplace, There are a lot of women leaders in Austin, and a lot of them are leaders in the business community, in the legal community, in the human services community. And women find today that this whole idea of doing it all is extremely exhausting. And a wonderful author in Austin, Susan Albert, wrote a book that I love to use with women. It's called Work of Our Own. And it talks about creating a life that's balanced and that works for you. And so I think our focus and what we see women doing over and over again is really recreating their lives till it fits. Fashioning it, not just responding or reacting, saying out loud, I want to have a family, or I want to stay single. Life choices, whether to have children or not. We have all varieties of lifestyles in our staff. Some of us were mothers and some of us weren't. Some of us are step-parents. Blended families, being a grandmother, and dealing with so many women now raise their grandchildren. I mean, this is just a whole new development in women's lives. Aging, again, not just for women, but the people they love, because women become the caretakers in the family at certain key points of aging parents or of spouses and partners. And that's not because we're perfect or special or different, it just still happens that way. And so I guess giving women kind of a resting place is an image for me. A place to come and play and dream and, you know, develop a sense of who they are to live the life they want to lead.
Right. And obviously the Institute's ministries to women, to all people, will grow and change as the needs in the community change.
Yes.
We've got about, a minute or so left. How would you sum up what you would like to say about either ministry to women or the ministry of the Institute or your philosophy? Give you a chance here.
Well, I think that, you know, along with all religious-based counselors in Austin, our greatest hope and the sort of emblematic sense of our name is that people believe that they can have a new life and that they feel hopeful in creating a new story for themselves and their families. This is a whole new trend in psychotherapy and in healing work and in medicine, that no change or transition is the end. And how do we have hope? Because without hope, you can't move. You know, you just don't know how to do your life. And so I don't want to speak for all the other folks in Austin, but I know that in all religious communities, hope and the ability to look forward to a future, even as a city, a future that we will fashion, is a very, very crucial component.
Okay. Thank you, Sarah. Obviously, there's a lot more conversation we could have, but thank you for being here today.
Thank you for asking us.
And we thank you for joining us as we've talked about the issues, the problems, but the possibilities facing all of us, particularly women, here in the Austin area. We wish all of you in this season new life, and we'll look forward to you joining us next week on Austin Faith Dialogue.
For more information, call Austin Metropolitan Ministries.